No matter what targets you set for yourself, how far you got within each of the challenges, we do want to congratulate you on taking the challenge, for engaging in the process, and we hope that it will be or has been of benefit to you. Now, some of you may be asking the question, if we've reached the summit, if we're on the top of our mountain of internal obligations, then what's left for us to do? Didn't we achieve the goal? Well, hang on. We're going to answer that question for you. Day 34 out of 40 days. We've walked through different levels. We've gone through base camp. We've identified obligation sources and their specific obligations and metadata. We've looked at incorporating obligations into your risk and compliance and obligation registers. We've looked at evaluating compliance risk. The last week, we focused on a compliance and risk plan. What do we need to do to make it to the top of the mountain? And that was your challenge for last week. This week, we've got a new challenge. It's the last challenge. It's a continuous challenge. It is just as important as all the rest. In fact, I might argue it is the most important challenge. And I hope that by the end of today's call, you will be in agreement that's the case. We're on top of internal obligations. And while we want to stay there, we want to stay on top of all our obligations. And so how do we sustain compliance? And that's our topic that we're going to dive into today, and will form the basis for your next challenge. It's the last challenge that you have with us, but it's a challenge that every person in risk and compliance has, and we hope that this is going to be helpful to you. When we think about obligations, this has been our mountain. This is what we've been climbing over the 40 days. Now that we're getting close to the end of the mount, we don't want to fall off, but just to remember where we've been. It all started at the bottom with accepting legal responsibility. This is base camp. This is the beginning. This is kind of where companies usually start to engage with respect to their compliance, maturity, and capabilities. But it doesn't end there. That's not the last place that companies end up. They usually move up, and they start to take on, let's say, more stakeholder responsibilities. And so they'll start to adopt standards, normative behaviors and practices. And there's many of them out there, and ISO is an international standard, but there are others. Depending on what industries you're in, there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of standards that one can choose, and sometimes they're chosen for you. But these have to do with managerial processes. And these are things that you conform to. The goal here is consistency. Well, it doesn't end there either. You continue to move up, and you accept what we would consider as Vision Zero objectives. Almost every industry has adopted some form of goal, a target, and it's an ambitious one. Many of you will remember this from the quality days when ISO 9000 started back in, probably late 80s, early 90s. Zero defects. It was all about getting to zero. And there was a lot of controversy around that, I remember, because, of course, the goal isn't zero defects. Not really. The goal is the pursuit of getting there. And that brings with it all the behaviors and practices of operational excellence. And those are the things that are important. So we're starting to see that across other areas: zero violations, zero incidents, zero breaches, zero emissions. And so all of these might be things that your business has decided to adopt. And of course, it's not whether you're in compliance or out of compliance. Here we're talking about advancing towards the goal. And that requires improvement of some sort. And then finally, at the top of the mountain, it's about dealing with stakeholder expectations in a broader sense, talking about taking on more social responsibilities, let's say, with regards to sustainability and environmental issues more precisely, and then governance. We call that ESG as an example. And these are things which have a lot to do with stakeholder responsibility. Now, to help stimulate our discussion and our kind of get us into the right framework here with regards to this, the topic of sustainable compliance, a quote from a person by the name of James Clear. He's the author of a book called Atomic Habits. And this quote is very important. He says, "You don't rise to the level of your goals, you fall to the level of your systems. You don't rise to the level of your goals, you fall to the level of your systems." And that's to a large degree very true. At least this is what I've found over the years, is that companies, they intend well, they create a project team and they move forward on their initiatives, and they make it up the hill, the mountain, but they start to take away the resources when the project is over, and it goes into maintenance mode. And instead of having a team of 6 people or so on the project, you now have got 1 person and maybe 1.5 people that are supporting this compliance system. And what's going to happen? It's very predictable. It's very much 3 steps forward, 2 steps back. They're falling. They've fallen off the mountain, and they've fallen to the level that their systems can support. So whatever systems you had, well, those are the things which are going to determine how far you fall. And we're here today to help you with some ideas and some concepts so that you don't fall at all, ever. And even when you do, you don't fall that far. That's what our goal is today. And so here's the big idea. The big idea is this, is that continuous compliance. Now that's really what we mean by sustainable compliance. Continuous compliance requires continuous improvement. Let's dive into this. We're going to unpack what it means to be continuously in compliance, and what does continuous improvement look like when we want to achieve a state of continuous compliance. Kind of paint the background of what we're going to be talking about even more. I'm going to talk about this chart, and I'm going to borrow something from the quality folks. And if this chart begins to look like a SPC or statistical process control chart, well, you're not going to be wrong. It's going to have elements that are going to look just like that. I hope that you'll find the analogy to be helpful. So let me orient you to this picture and to the chart. At the bottom, we have, let's say, a lower target that we're trying to achieve. This is, let's say, the minimum level of performance. This is the minimum level of compliance, if you'd like. And below this, well, we will end up experiencing the effects of non-conformance because we're going to be out of compliance. And so we don't want to be there. But as we move up the chart, well, there's at the top a higher standard, an upper target. It's not really a maximum limit, but it's the next objective that we want to achieve. And perhaps this has less to do with regulatory obligations, but more to do with our internal obligations, because our internal ones are where we usually talk about our commitment to compliance, and we want to have high standards and perhaps even higher standards than what regulation compels us to do. And so that's our upper target. And this has a lot to do with where we've been going up the mountain. And the bottom being base camp and dealing with regulatory, and the above being dealing with stakeholder obligations and expectations. And so, well, that's our chart. And maybe we've been, tracking how we've been doing, and I hope that you have. where are you? What's your compliance status? And you may do that using audits, perhaps, and assessments, and that's good. And you may have some kind of a chart, and well, you want to get to a place where you're meeting your obligations, let's say, your compliance, your lower target, at least that's where you want to get to. And that's good. And that's good. But what we've noticed here is that most of the time, we're operating either just below or close to this level of targets. You see, once we get into compliance, we tend to relax a little bit. We're maybe not as rigorous than we need to be. We need to audit as much as we ought to, and while we fall out of compliance. And I've worked at this field long enough to know that in some cases, and I'm not saying it's everyone, but it's certainly some people, some organizations, they work really hard to pass an audit, but once the auditor leaves, well, business as usual, perhaps, and you go back to the way things were, and we're out of compliance before the auditor has left the parking lot. Maybe that's like that for you, maybe not to that degree, but kind of where people live. This is a reactive place to be. There's going to be gaps. And if you take an average, you take the mean, what do you find is that most of the time you're going to be out of compliance. Occasionally you will be in, but most of the time you'll be operating at a level below compliance. And so perhaps this is not the best place to be. We have a name for this. This is called the vicious cycle of nonconformance. If you think about this other chart here, where we've got nonconformance at the bottom and compliance outcomes, the things we want to achieve, the benefits of being in compliance, like resiliency and safety and quality and trust. We want those things. Well, we're going to find that when we're reactive, when we're in this zone, reactive zone, things get worse, and the faster things get worse, because it reinforces this behavior of, audit, fix, audit, fix, audit, we'll find the gaps, we'll fix it. We're filling potholes along a road that maybe sometimes needs to be replaced rather than being patched. And this is a world where we find that people don't have clear objectives and goals. So they never know where they're going, what their targets are. They never know if they're fully in compliance or not. There's a lot of uncertainty. And they usually use lagging indicators. And if you're using audits, well, that's what you're using because, well, how often do you do your audits? Once a year, every 3 years? It's going to be different, of course, for different compliance domains. But they're going to tell you how things were. They're not going to tell you how things are or how things need to be. People tend to be, well, surprised. All that uncertainty means, well, you're going to be surprised. Oh, we found something else again. And maybe that's the only surprise that we're not surprised about, is that we find things that we need to address. And we're always going to be behind. Just like I showed in the chart, we find that we're always trying to get back into compliance. Wouldn't it be nice if we were always there all the time? Because you're going to find that you spend as much resources and money by trying to catch up than you were if you were just always there. And I'm going to show you how you can do that. I'm going to show you how you can do that. So if you think about the systems that you have, the organizational resources, the capabilities you have centered around things like programs and systems and processes. And if we had time, we could certainly unpack all those, but today we're not going to. But what we find is that companies, when they're reactive, what do? What does compliance do? What does the audit group do? Well, they double down on their audits. We're just going to do more of them, but not in the right way that they're going to do more of them. I don't know if you do this now, but this was quite common. This is still quite common, is that to get ready for an external audit, we're going to do an internal audit. To get ready for an internal audit, we're going to do a pre-audit, right? And before you know it, you're doing 3 audits. 3 audits, when maybe only 1 was necessary because you weren't sure whether you were in compliance. And there's 4 different ways in which this is a problem, and 4 reasons why you don't want to do this. 4 reasons. Now, reason number 1, audits typically only focus on verification, on what was done, the activities, never usually focused on whether we got the benefit from all the work that we did with compliance. It never tends to focus on the outcomes. Number 2, audit findings usually end up becoming the requirements for compliance rather than focusing on the original obligation sources. I don't know how many times we've gone into organizations and we've asked them what their obligations were, and they pointed to an audit questionnaire or a checklist. And yes, those are going to be some of them, but is that all? The primary, the most important requirements? And they tend to focus on the things that you can measure through an audit. We seldom find that they include the things that are essential for an organization to achieve the benefits of being in compliance. So that's a problem. And number 3 problem of doubling down on audits is it tends to reinforce the fact that the only driver for improvement usually ends up being closing gaps in an audit rather than improving the capabilities to always stay in compliance and perhaps never need an audit to begin with at all. Wouldn't that be interesting if that were to happen? And the last reason why you might not want to do this is that the audit function tends to inappropriately assume managerial accountability. And what I mean by that is that people look to the audit function to tell them what their obligations are because they don't own the obligations. And so this diminishes responsibility and improvements because the business isn't responsible for what's going on. It's usually the compliance department that ends up taking the weight. Of course, it can't carry the weight, right? Meeting obligations needs to be embedded throughout the organization and not just within one particular department. But that's what companies do when they're in the reactive zone. They double down on their audits. Let's go back to this SPC chart of our compliance, and maybe you started to make some improvements and you started to close the gaps, and that's always a good thing to do. I'm not saying we shouldn't do that. But you've maybe started to get better at compliance and you've raised your standard and you've moved above the lower target. And well, that's good. That's good. You find that most of the time you're going to be in compliance and you're going to be less reactive when that happens. And so what do we call this? We call this entering the conformance zone. The conformance zone. And it's at this nexus, is the intersection between the world of being reactive and the world of being proactive. And I've seen this many, many, many times, is that companies, when they find that they're starting to make some improvement, and they're starting to see some of the benefits even, they say, okay, maybe we're spending too much money now on compliance. We did okay last year, we're going to do okay this year. We don't need as many people. We need less auditors, less inspectors. We need less of that. We take our hands off the wheel. We stop paying attention and we end up falling back to the reactive zone and being out of compliance. 3 steps forward, 2 steps back. So we don't want to stay in the conformance zone. We don't want to become complacent. We need to keep moving up the mountain. We need to keep improving. And so what does that look like? And for this, I'm going to just remind us of the quote we started with from James Clear, that we don't rise to the level of our goals. We fall to the level of our systems. You should be far more concerned with your current trajectory than with your current results. And he's absolutely right. He's absolutely right. It's not the results we haven't achieved. You're at the top of the mountain, and that's good, but it doesn't end there. And if you're not continually improving, well, you're going to fall off the mountain and you're going to fall out of compliance. So, how do we avoid that? Well, we raise our standards even higher. We take on that challenge. We look at the next mountain of obligations and we raise our performance so that you can see from this chart is we are well above the conformance zone and we're well above the reactive zone. But we're not standing still. That's the key thing. We are moving up the mountain. We're moving up the mountain. And one of the things that you find here, we have a name for what it's like when companies do this. It's called the virtuous conformance zone. The virtuous conformance zone. And what happens here is that things start to get better. And the faster things get better. It's like interest in your bank account. Interest is the level of proactivity, let's say. And well, the more interest you have, the more proactive you are. And the more principal you have, well, not only does it get better this year, well, it compounds on top of each other. And so it grows, it accrues over time. And so before you know it, things start getting easier. It's easy to be in compliance. It's not hard. It's not a challenge, right? It's not patching holes all the time. We're always there. We're always where we need to be. And we're, instead of being uncertain and surprised, we're certain and anticipating. Instead of focusing on symptoms, we're focusing on the root cause. We're looking at leading indicators rather than lagging indicators. Instead of being always behind, we're always ahead. Really quite remarkable when this happens is that companies start to get a return on their compliance investment. Wouldn't that be nice than just seeing it as an expense and as an expenditure and a loss, certainly a sunk cost, right? Where you paid for compliance and then you're paying to patch it up again. It's like having a defect and you pay once for the part, you pay again for the defect, and then you pay again so that the defect doesn't happen again. You paid 3 times what it cost you when you could have just been there all along. The improvement cycle is different than being in the reactive zone. It's instead of audit fix, it's learning and improving. Learning and improving. And this is a wonderful place to be, and it's something that companies that have been doing compliance for a while, the ones that are excellent in this regard, that's the world that they live in, and it's a much better place to be. And while it starts to look different, it means that companies start to take ownership of their obligations, all of them, not just the mandatory ones, but also the voluntary, the internal obligations. The other thing that the world looks like when you're in this virtuous compliance cycle is you start to embed your compliance into your programs, systems, and processes. It's not just done by the audit department or the audit function or the compliance function. Compliance is and risk management is broadly delegated, perhaps, or distributed would be a better word, across the organization. And the third thing that looks like is that companies, they don't rely on audits to tell them the status of their compliance. No, it's too slow. Like waiting a year for an audit or 3 years is way too slow to deal with the effects of uncertainty, which move quite like faster than that. Put in processes and controls so that they know the status of their compliance in real time. That's the goal. Not of all of them there. Maybe it's better than the frequency of audits, let's say. And the fourth thing that we look at is that they improve their compliance on an incremental and continuous basis. They do this not because they have to do it, it's because there's huge benefits from doing so. This is where we want to be, and when we're here, we experience the benefits, such as greater resiliency, greater stakeholder trust, perhaps even greater stakeholder value. And those are things that organizations need and they want, and well, compliance can help them get there when they're proactive. Here's a plan. You're going to come up with your own plan for continuous improvement. And well, I hope I've helped you at least understand that there's going to be different cycles of improvement, perhaps, based on what zone you end up being in. 10 steps that you can have as part of your plan. And some of these we've already done as part of this challenge, but there's others still left to do, still for you to do. We've talked about number one, which is to document the context and expectations for each obligation. We need to know our obligations. What does it mean? As Amy mentioned at the beginning, understanding some of those regulations and legalese is not easy. And understanding what those obligations are and what does it mean for your business, well, that's important. You need to do that. We need to define what constitutes evidence of compliance. This is extremely important because these are the things that if you structured it in a certain way, you can start to automate this so you can check for this in real time and ensure it doesn't mean that you never do physical audits and you never look at behaviors and things of that nature in certain industries. That's important. It needs to continue to be done, but there's a lot of compliance that gets done by checking the existence of things. Do you have a report for this? Do you have a procedure? Do you have the operator logs and equipment logs and things like that that could certainly reduce the burden on audit function? Well, we need to figure out how to measure our progress towards the outcomes. We need to look at standards to establish normative behaviors. We may use ISO. There's lots of others as well that we may use to standardize our approach to compliance. I certainly recommend you do that. You need to identify what is needed by your organization to achieve your outcomes of compliance. This has to do with capabilities. What capabilities do you need today, or that if you had would help you be in compliance all the time? All the time. Right? Maybe we don't ask that question. Maybe we could ask it more often. We need to look at risk. We didn't talk about this one yet. Number 7, we need to establish clear accountabilities and responsibilities for meeting our obligations. We need to have someone responsible for these things. And there's a difference between accountability and responsibility. And while we need to embed our compliance into and our controls and our risk treatment into organizational program systems and processes. And I know that happens. There's a lot of controls that companies have. And some of that is documented, some of that's automated, and that's good. And we need to continue to do that. We need to do more of that. And we need to work towards being able to monitor our status in real time, rather than waiting for an audit to tell us whether we're in compliance or not. If we're going to keep up with the effects of uncertainty and the speed of risk, well, that's going to be extremely important. And the last thing, we need to continuously improve, but perhaps not where you thought. We need to improve our progress towards effectiveness, not just efficiency, but effectiveness. That's the standard, that's the high level mark, and that's what keeps us way out of being reactive to being proactive. And it's that pursuit of compliance effectiveness which will produce all the right behaviors, so that not only will you not achieve compliance in ways that you currently perhaps define it, but you start to experience the benefits of compliance. Right, that return on investment, that's really important. That's what we want to do. And that requires continual improvement. So let me just walk you through fairly quickly here before we introduce the challenge, kind of what this looks like, what this might look like. And I'm borrowing here from another person. His name is Elihu Goldratt, who some of you may or may not know, the author of The Theory of Constraints, leader in process improvement. But let's imagine the following for a moment. Let's imagine that every year you conduct an audit. It's a yearly audit, it's a year-end audit, and it takes you 20 days of to do. You pull everybody together, you almost disrupt the organization, you shut down everything, you freeze everything so you can't do anything while you're doing the audit. And I know that some companies, that's exactly what it looks like. It's quite disruptive. It's quite and necessary, yes, perhaps, but disruptive nevertheless. And so it takes you 20 days to do it, and you're sitting in, you're interviewing, you're collecting documents, you're getting reports, and there are internal audits and external audits, and there you go, you have it all there. You do that every year, and you end up with a compliance status of yearly. And I'm going to should have put that in quotes because I don't really say that's really the status of your compliance. It's a measure of compliance status, let's say, but it's not the complete picture. And decide that you're going to improve. You're going to say, Ray, that's good. We're going to do some improvement, continuous improvement, and we're going to start to collect those areas that we can make a difference on, and we're going to try to focus first on efficiency, let's say. And so you decide that maybe you're going to automate your audit process to improve efficiency. And well, that's okay, that's good, you know, and so you've reduced the number of days to do it, let's say to 5 days. Well, isn't that wonderful? That's great, 5 days, 15 days less, and less people perhaps too. And so, okay, you've got some benefit from doing so. And so your yearly audit, well, it only takes 5 days, and well, it's less disruptive perhaps. And you still end up with a yearly compliance status. So it doesn't tell you more often, let's say, whether you're in compliance. It's doing it with less resources, and that's okay, but it doesn't change the cadence and the behaviors of the company. Still around this yearly process. But let's imagine we take it one step further. One step further. Let's look at, looking at improving our effectiveness. And what we're going to do here is we're going to introduce, instead of just automation, we're going to introduce a compliance management system, CMS, perhaps an integrated way of doing obligations, audits, and actions, let's say, to pull this together so you know your obligations in real time and you can really get a hold of all this. And what you find out is that, well, instead of just doing a yearly audit, well, maybe you could do some of it monthly. And I know some of you might say, wait a minute, we don't want to do more audits. But it's possible that you might, when you think about it from a proactive perspective and from an assessment perspective, and say you do it monthly, and well, you end up with a monthly compliance status. So 12 times a year, you know where you are, at least as far as the audit's concerned. 12 times a year, and wouldn't that be better? Because how far can you get out of compliance in a month versus a year, or even 3 years if you do an audit every 3 years on certain aspects? So this changes the way we think about things. And well, if you've been tracking me, you certainly can know that we're talking about continuous compliance. Requires continuous improvement, and one thing it's going to also require is some degree of continuous auditing, right? But not perhaps in the way that you thought. There's lots of things that we can get evidence of compliance up front, and maybe we can even do it weekly. Maybe that would be better, even for certain areas. But this kind of approach would end up being that we can stay out of the reactive zone and stay on top of the mountain, not having these big gaps that we now need to catch up on and spend the money all over again to get back into compliance. What benefits would accrue if you were always in compliance? Always in compliance. What would that look like? Continuous compliance, sustainable compliance requires continuous improvement. And that is what your next challenge is going to be. Your continuous challenge is to stay on top of the mountain. Stay on top of the mountain.